Okay. In these last couple of weeks of Mortal Questions, we're starting on a new field, really, and that field is to do with bioethics. And the book you're reading for this, well, you're reading a chapter or two from Belshaw, because we've been using that to sort of structure the course, but the book that we're focusing on more specifically is, of course, Peter Singer's book, Rethinking Life and Death. And for this unit, I wanted you to read the part one. Now, this part one discusses, among other things, it discusses a number of interesting and controversial cases from recent medical history, and analyzes various approaches to them. And well, actually, it's more of a straightforward history. There's not that much philosophy in this, despite the fact that Peter Singer is a very well-respected philosopher. We're not going to talk about every single case, and I'll sort of focus on the philosophy because that's what we're mostly interested in. But that's partly why I asked you to read, 4 chapters, which is a bit more than you're used to. But I think you probably already found that it's much easier reading than some of the stuff you've been asked to read. Singer does a very good job of making this accessible to anyone, I think. So bioethics is, first of all, ethics. That means it's to do with questions of right and wrong, morality. What should we do? What is the right thing to do in particular circumstances? And it's bioethics because it's to do with biology, or more specifically, medical issues. So medical ethics, really. Bioethics in general focuses on a set of key issues. Issues to do with personal autonomy, who gets to decide in certain cases, like are people allowed to deny treatment in life-saving situations to themselves? Are they allowed to deny them to others? Those kinds of things. And also life and death issues. And of course, life and death issues are the ones that Singer is focusing on. When is it appropriate to end life, and so on. And actually, he starts out by discussing an issue that we might think is familiar from Feldman, which is, when does life end? But he's approaching it in a different way from Feldman. You might not remember, but Feldman makes a distinction between an analysis of life and a criterion, an analysis of death and a criterion of death. And he says criterion is not what he was going to talk about. Criterion of death can change depending on the state of technology, and it doesn't tell us what death is. It just tells us when somebody has died. So, for example, in the old days, a criterion of death might be, whether or not the person mists up a mirror that you hold in front of their mouth, or whether or not they have a pulse. Whereas now, I think most of us are familiar with the idea that the criterion of death is brain death. Well, what's interesting about Singer's, the first 4 chapters, is he gives a nice little history of how this came to be, the criterion of death. And he also clarifies that it is not that actually, well, the criterion is death of the whole brain, but he points out that this is often not held to, and will argue, in fact, that we shouldn't require that it be death of the whole brain. We should be able to take organs from humans who have some brain function remaining. For example, anencephalic infants, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so perhaps I should say a little bit about Belshaw. Belshaw's chapter is life sacred? And he doesn't really answer this question. He answers the question, what does it even mean to say that life is sacred? And ends up deciding that it's not very clear, and people tend to use the phrase to mean basically what they want it to mean. I mean, on the face of it, saying that life is sacred should cover all living things. For example, there is an offshoot of Hinduism called Jainism, Jain, that does take this very seriously, that all life is sacred. I don't know what they eat. I don't know if they include vegetable. I don't think they include vegetable life as well, because otherwise, what would they live on? Minerals or something. But they do take it very seriously when it comes to animal life. So much so that I understand some Jains will wear those little masks over their faces so that they don't accidentally breathe in small creatures and kill them that way. And they also sort of sweep in front of themselves so that they don't squash tiny insects or something. Now, we might regard this as silly and a bit humorous, but certainly that is consistent with the idea that life is sacred. Yeah, I mean, for example, the pro-life movement in America, are they vegetarians? I don't think so. No doubt there are certainly some pro-lifers who are vegetarian, but it seems to me that there's a significant overlap between pro-lifers and people who actually would regard vegetarianism as a bad thing. So the pro-life movement in America, in particular, because that's what I'm familiar with, does not mean pro all, even animal life. It just means pro human life. I mean, you see bumper stickers that say abortion stops a beating heart. Well, so does your steak, right? That stops a beating heart because they kill the cow to get it. But I don't think most pro-choicers care about that. They're focusing specifically on human life. Well then, that's worth pointing out that when people say that life is sacred, sometimes they are not talking about all life. They're certainly not talking about vegetable life, which, if you remember, Feldman wanted to make the concept of life and the concept of death applicable to all living things, including, he said, when I say that John F. Kennedy died and the oak tree in my garden died, I want to mean the same thing. I want it to be something that is equally applicable to both of them. That was what he meant by biological conception of life and death. Whereas, of course, the criterion of brain death can only really apply, it can only apply to things with brains, so obviously not oak trees. And usually it's talking about human brains. But certainly Singer is sort of on the same side as Feldman in some respects when he says at one point, it seems a little weird to say of, for example, an anencephalic infant that they are pink, presumably he's talking about Caucasian anencephalic infant, pink, supple, and dead. If you take the proposed new standard of death that we'll get to, that they talked about in that conference in Melbourne, described in chapter 3, then you would say of an anencephalic child that it is dead, that the child is dead, despite the fact that it is pink and breathing. That, Singer says, seems weird. And in that, he's in agreement with somebody who described it as an ethical fiction to describe anencephalic and cortically dead infants, cortically dead, as actually dead. Okay. Belshaw says a few things that are interesting. One in particular, he contrasts the attitude to Uncle Joe by various people. There's Uncle Joe is old, ill, and in a hospital. Everyone agrees that it's just a matter of time. Katerina, who's always been a bit hard-hearted, thinks it would be better if things were brought to an end right now. After all, life's no fun for Joe. He can't work. He's no use to anyone. And think of the hospital bills they'll save. So Katerina's view is that Joe's life has lost instrumental value. An instrumental value, you might remember, is valuable. Something has instrumental value insofar as it's a means to an end where the end is valuable. So, for example, money is not intrinsically valuable. It's not valuable in itself. It's just instrumentally valuable because it can get you stuff that you want. If, you know, well, in Germany in the Great Depression, money became pretty much valueless because of inflation was so catastrophic. You needed a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. So it lost even instrumental value. All right, so Katerina's view seems to be that the only value that Joe's life had was instrumental, and it's lost that, so his life is valueless. Alternatively, Piet says they should do everything possible to manage the pain, make Joe's remaining life a thing of dignity and value, and give him a little bit more of a life he'd want to live. Now, Piet is clearly focusing on the value of Joe's life to Joe himself, what Belshaw calls personal value. So, insofar as Joe's life has a value, the important sense of value is the value it has for Joe. If, on the other hand, Joe was asking for death, then Piet would say, okay, help him commit suicide, because clearly the only way his life could have value is to him, and he is making it clear that it doesn't have value to him, so it has no value anymore. Finally, there's Vincent, who said Vincent agrees about money, but he's skeptical about whether more can be done to help Joe. So he doesn't actually think that Joe can be made comfortable or Joe can enjoy what's left of his life. Yet he's opposed to euthanasia, which of course means ending mercy killing, whether or not this is what Joe wants. He thinks that however bad it is, life should be lived to the end. Now, what he says is that the intrinsic value of Joe's life is something over and above Joe's attitude to it. And this often seems to be what people who are opposed to euthanasia argue, that life is valuable even if the person living it no longer values it. There was a play, I think it was a play, they made it into a movie called Whose Life Is It Anyway?, which was about someone who was severely disabled so that he couldn't kill himself. He's like Ramon, I think, in the second of the two. Yeah, Ramon, who is confined to a hospital bed because he's paralyzed. He can't kill himself, and this was this was based on a real case. So the lead character in Whose Life Is It Anyway is not allowed to commit suicide. Well, he can't commit suicide, and he's not allowed to get anyone to help him because assisted suicide is illegal. And he campaigns for the right to be helped to die. And of course, there's the famous cases in Michigan of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, who did just that. He invented a machine where even somebody severely disabled could, flip a switch that opened a tube of gas and they could kill themselves. But so in most of the cases, actually, he didn't do anything, but finally he filmed himself actually doing it for someone who was incapable of doing them for themselves, and that's what got him imprisoned in the end. But he did it because, people asked him to. People wrote to him all the time saying, help me die. So there's Belshaw makes a three-part distinction. You can value life instrumentally. It's valuable insofar as other people value it. And I think most of us have that attitude about, for example, non-human animals. There's an organization called Ducks Unlimited, and Ducks Unlimited fights to preserve wetlands for ducks. Now, why do they do this? Is because they think that ducks are valuable. Ducks' lives are valuable because the ducks value them? No, they want to hunt them. So the point is to keep ducks going so that they can be a source of fun for people who want to hunt them. So clearly their view of the value of ducks is ducks' lives is instrumental. They're valuable insofar as humans enjoy killing them. If I'm unfairly misrepresenting Ducks Unlimited, perhaps someone could let me know, but I think that's right. Alternatively, you know, someone who says if somebody wants to commit suicide, that's their decision. We'll try to talk them out of it, but it is their life, and if they don't value it anymore, as sadly Robin Williams, of course, it seems like he didn't. Then it's their life, it's up to them. They're the ones who decide. And then alternatively, there's this third view that says, no, the value of your life is not limited to whether or not you value it. It is valuable in itself, and you just can't take, usually human life, even if you want to, and even if it's your own, because it's a thing of value and it's not up to you. It's like, you know, if you owned a Picasso, I think a lot of people would say you still shouldn't be allowed to destroy it. Even if you own it, you shouldn't be allowed to destroy it because it's valuable in itself. It's like valuable to humanity or something. It has intrinsic value so that it's not up to you, even if you officially own it. If, you know, the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, if it turned out that the Louvre owned it and they said, we're sick of people just coming to look at this damn picture, so we're going to destroy it, I think there would be an outcry, even though, you know, it's an inanimate object and in theory it belongs to them because it has, we might say, intrinsic value. So people have that idea about life. There's another distinction that Belshaw makes, talking about persons and humans. And I think we can come back to that after talking a little bit about... I'm just going to go through the 4 chapters of Singer, sort of in roughly the order that he does, because he does a very good job of letting the account unfold in an informative way. Okay, so he starts off giving a couple of cases of Tricia Marshall in Oakland and Marion Ploch in Germany in 1992 and 1993, which would be actually pretty much the year that he wrote this book. Sadly, this book hasn't been updated since the early 90s, you know, which I am horrified to realize is 20 years. But it's also still pretty relevant. I don't know what that says about us. But and he was pretty cutting edge at the time he was writing it. Some things have changed. So, for example, Oregon, and I think Washington State too now, you have the right to die. You have the right to get a lethal prescription. That's changed since he wrote the book, I think. But a lot of things haven't changed. Okay, so there are these 2 women who were both pregnant when they entered what is sometimes called persistent vegetative states. And there was this dispute over whether or not they should be kept alive. Now, again, that phrase, kept alive, assumes that somebody who is in a persistent vegetative state doesn't count as alive. And actually, Singer is going to say, I think Singer is going to side pretty much with Feldman and say, yes, they are alive. They are alive in the sense of working organs. They are not decomposing. But he's also going to say their life is not of value to them, so you are not doing anything wrong if you end their lives, because he is going to argue, little spoiler alert here, he's going to argue that lives do not have absolute value. So he's going to argue against his version of the sanctity of life view. The sanctity of life view, as he interprets it, says all life is of equal value and also essentially infinite value, so that you can never end the life of an innocent human being. And this is the view of a Cambridge ethicist that he quotes at the beginning of chapter 4. This is John Keown. Traditional medical ethics never asked whether the patient's life is worthwhile, for the notion of a worthless life is as alien to the Hippocratic tradition, of course all doctors take the Hippocratic oath, as it is to the English criminal law, both of which subscribe to the principle of the sanctity of human life, which holds that because all lives are intrinsically valuable, it is always wrong intentionally to kill an innocent human being. So John Keown disagreed with the decision in the Tony Bland case, which is discussed in chapter 4, where the law lords, which are sort of the equivalent of the Supreme Court in England, although they have amazingly English double-barreled names and titles, but they took this case very seriously and decided that it would be permissible to cease keeping Tony Bland alive. I mean, he was alive in the sense that his body, his lungs were working and so on, and his heart was pumping. But because his life was not of value to him, then it would not be a bad thing to end that life. Life is only worth sustaining when it is of value to the person who has it. And when they are incapable of consciousness, was essentially the decision, it is no longer valuable to them. So there's nothing wrong with ending it. Whereas Keown is saying you can never say that. You can never say there's nothing wrong in ending a human life, and you can't make judgments about the value of a human life. All human life is similarly valuable. You can't end it. That's the view that Singer labels the sanctity of life view, and he's going to argue for a different view, which is that lives can be of different values. There are some lives. So the way that people want to avoid saying that lives are of different value is by defining death, by shifting the definition of death. So this discussion of the history of the definition of the death and how the line moved, Singer sees as a history of, as he says it, a fig leaf, a moral fig leaf, an attempt to hide the fact that we are in fact making quality of life decisions. We are ranking certain lives as more valuable than others. That's what we're really doing. That's what our practice involves. But we don't want to admit that. We want to claim to be holding this sanctity of life view, that all lives are sacred. It's just that these people are dead, when obviously they're not really dead. We just don't care about their lives, is Singer's interpretation. So that's sort of the point of this little history, as he makes that clear later on. All right, so there's the case of Marion Plock and Tricia Marshall. Marion Plock, they didn't successfully bring the baby to term, but Tricia Marshall, they did. Darius Marshall would be 21. I wonder, maybe you can Google what happened to Darius Marshall, because he was born in the 3rd of August 1993 to someone who they then turned off the life support. So they only kept Tricia Marshall's body alive from 21 April to 3rd of August 1993 to sustain and bring Darius Marshall to term. And they did the same with Marion Plock. And as he makes clear, there were a lot of people who were not happy about this. They said, you are using... some people argued that it was disrespectful to the mothers, that in some sense they were just being used as support systems for the babies. And it's not really clear why they did this, because, well, actually, even the person, Dr. James Jackson, who was the chairman of the maternal and child health services at Highland Hospital, where Tricia Marshall was treated. He wasn't sure that they did the right thing. At the end of chapter 1, he compares what they did to the building the bridge on the River Kwai. Now, that's a reference to an actual incident, and there's a famous movie made of it, where these, I don't know if they were all English, but certainly the commander, played by Alec Guinness, you know, the original Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of his least liked roles. He thought Star Wars was pretty much trash. He's in a bunch of great movies. The Ealing comedies are the best movies for Alec Guinness. In particular, The Lady Killers, and there's a film called Kind Hearts and Coronets, where he plays a whole bunch of different people. Those are the best Alec Guinness movies. But anyway, in The Bridge on the River Kwai, these English prisoners of the Japanese are instructed to build a bridge. Now, this is a bridge that is going to help the Japanese war effort. I can't remember the details, but it's a bridge over a river that will allow them to move weaponry or something, and so will it be of great help to the Japanese war effort. And to sort of keep the men under his command, who are all prisoners of war, engaged, and, you know, to maintain their sort of spirit, he gets them involved in this heroic project to achieve this apparently impossible goal of building this bridge. And then when he's built it, he sort of has this realization, oh shit, I've helped the enemy. It was a marvelous thing we did. It was an incredible thing we did, but it's not a good thing that we did. And at the end of the movie, he destroys it, and it's tragic. You have to see the film. And so when Dr. Jackson compares bringing Darius Marshall to term to that, you can see he is very torn about this. That what have we done? We've shown that it's possible to keep a brain dead woman alive long enough to bring her baby to term. The downsides to that is that now we might start requiring that. In all cases where this happens, we will be required to do that. And what that means is enormous expense, medical expense, because, you know, who was paying for this? Actually, the hospital, I think, ended up paying for it, because the state health insurer said, no, we're not going to cover this. We don't think this is a good thing. Which, of course, because of course they realized if they did cover it, they'd have to cover it in every instance, and these cases might multiply. That's always the downside to any improvement in medical technology. It's gonna, you know, old people can now live a hell of a lot longer than they used to, and they're a lot more expensive. They're still nothing like as expensive as the money spent on preemies. Preemies are the most expensive medical patients. But again, preemies used to just die, and that was an expense that didn't have to be paid for. But now we have these amazing machines that cost millions of dollars that can keep incredibly premature babies alive. My nephew and niece were twins. My niece Polly weighed less than 2 pounds at birth, and she's healthy, although still rather small. 12-year-old, 11 or 12, I should keep track of her birthday, because of the improvements in medical technology. And in England, that was covered by the National Health, which means that the British public paid an awful lot of money to ensure that she was kept alive. So there's always sort of hidden costs of any advances, and Jackson was torn about the value of this. It was more or less sort of to prove that it could be done. But now they've done it, what does that mean? So these are cases where now notice this was a case where they kept the women alive just as long as it took, and then they took them off respirators. So they didn't really value the women's lives except insofar as they were means of bringing the babies to term. but they seemed to value the babies' lives who were at an age where they, certainly in Germany, could be legally aborted. So that is a question about what attitude should we take to the unborn. All right, then chapter 2 moves into a little history of the criterion of death. And you probably, well, before I read this book, which I read some time ago, I wasn't aware of this whole Harvard committee on the definition of death, that our current medical standard, it's probably been tinkered with a little, but largely pretty much it's pretty much the same as the one suggested by this committee in 1968. Now, why 1968? Why were we moving along with, you know, some old standard of death, which was essentially, if you don't have a pulse, you're dead? And why did we move to this brain death standard? Well, the answer, says Singer, is to do with technology again. There were two advancements in medical science. The first one took place in the 1950s, and was it Holland or Denmark? I can't remember. But they invented an artificial respirator. This was because of a polio epidemic, where if you had polio, you were unable to breathe for yourself. You were temporarily paralyzed, and the only way to keep you alive is to basically pump air into your lungs physically. And for a while there were wards full of polio victims with nurses literally using bellows manually, constantly, to keep breathing for them. And then some enterprising person invented the artificial respirator, which essentially does the same thing, only you don't need a nurse to stand there and pump. So people who would have died survived, and actually once this temporary period of paralysis goes past, they can breathe for themselves. So great. But it was also used on people who otherwise would have died because their brains are damaged, and they enter irreversible comas, and they couldn't breathe for themselves. But if you put them on artificial respirators, it'll breathe for them, and it'll keep them alive, even though their brains will never function fully again. They will never have a sensation or thought again, but they're alive. So what do we do with them? By the old standard, if we were to unplug the respirator, we'd be killing them. So there was sort of this fear that wards would fill up with people whose brains would never again function. They would never be conscious again. They now no longer have the part of the brain that makes consciousness possible, and they just sit there until they die of old age, essentially, until something causes their bodies to pack up. But that could be years and years, as it in fact was by Joey Fieri. I haven't looked him up. He might still be alive. He had a seizure in 1976, but at the time of writing of this book, he was still alive, being kept alive on a respirator. Okay, so that was the first technical advance. And the second one was in 1967, the first heart transplant done by the South African doctor, Dr. Christian Barnard. Now, what's that got to do with respirators? The answer is, before it was done, nobody had a need for hearts because, you know, people couldn't get a new heart. It was deemed impossible. But once he did it, there were people who wanted heart transplants. And unlike kidneys, for example, hearts cannot be stored. The only way, a heart has to be pretty much taken from a body where it is still beating for it to be of any use. You can't take a heart from a cadaver and use it. You have to take a beating heart out of somebody, presumably, who's still using it, if it's beating, for it to be of value, for it to work. So you can put 2 and 2 together. Because of the respirator, we have these wards full of people who have beating hearts, but will never be conscious again. They're a worry because they're taking up resources from people who can actually have thoughts and feel. But on the other hand, they're a good source of beating hearts. And they don't really care about their hearts because they'll never have a thought again. But we can use them now because somebody has invented this technique of heart transplantation. So pretty much put the 2 together, and wouldn't it be a good thing if we're allowed to take the hearts from these people in irreversible comas? And that's essentially what the Harvard Committee decided. They published a report in 1968 where they said, our primary purpose is to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. There are 2 reasons why there is a need for a definition. 1, improvements in resuscitative and supportive measures have led to increased efforts to save those who are desperately injured. Sometimes these efforts have only a partial success, so the result is an individual whose heart continues to beat, but whose brain is irreversibly damaged. The burden is great on patients who suffer permanent loss of intellect. No, it isn't. There's no burden on those patients. They're totally unaware. On their families, yes, that's true. On the hospitals, that's certainly true. And on those in need of hospital beds already occupied by these comatose patients. So they come out and essentially say, these people aren't really worth the beds they're taking up. That, as Singer points out, is a quality of life judgment. But it's masked neatly if you say they're dead. We're not making a quality of life judgment. We're not saying that some lives are better than others, because these people are dead. And of course, dead people are of less value. So if we move the line so that we count those as dead, whereas before they were alive, then we're not killing them to take their organs, because they're already dead. Great. And we get to use those organs to save people who are not brain dead. So obsolete criteria for the definition of death can lead to a controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. Obsolete? What does that mean? You don't like them anymore? Essentially, that's what Singer says. Now, don't get me wrong. Singer is not opposed to this. He absolutely thinks it's the right thing to do to remove organs from brain dead people and use them to save the lives of people who just have bad hearts for whatever reason. He's all in favor of that. But what he's opposed to is sort of hypocrisy and mealy-mouthed and claiming that these people who are brain dead are actually dead, because he says they're not. Dead means dead. You know, dead is when they start to rot. These people aren't dead. We just don't value their lives anymore. That's okay. But we've got to admit that. We've got to admit that some lives are not of value. And the lives of people whose brains don't work anymore are not of value. One way to put this distinction, and I'm going to return to Belshaw again, is I'm going to give you a little chart. Here you go. Oh, I spilled water on it. It's a Venn diagram. That was on the Google Doodle a few days ago because it was the birthday of John Venn, the great British mathematician who invented Venn diagrams. Anyway, you probably are familiar with Venn diagrams. So, normally we assume that humans and persons are a single circle. They refer to the same thing. But this is not necessarily the case. And in medical ethics, it is widely agreed on that these are distinct terms. Now, there is actually a wider overlap than I've made it look. Certainly the vast majority of persons of which we are aware are humans. You and I, here's you, here's me. We are persons and we're humans, assuming, you know, you're not watching this from space and you're not an alien walking amongst us, I'm going to assume. So we are both humans and persons. However, it is possible to be a human and not be a person. And I'm going to say that Tony Bland might be an example. He's certainly human. He's even alive. But he is not a person, because we're going to define persons as beings whom it would be murder to kill. That's not the only definition, but that's a definition that's good enough for now. So clearly the Law Lords decided it was not murder to bring about Tony Bland's death. Well, they were kind of, they said you couldn't go up to him with a gun and shoot him. Although one of the judges said, well, why do we have to let him starve to death? Because essentially that's what they do. Once you remove him from life support, and you pull out his feeding tube, he's starving to death. And the Law Lord said, well, why don't we just end it quickly with an overdose of morphine or something like that? But there's still this standard where that's considered actively killing him, and we're not allowed to do that. But we can let nature take its course. I was doing air quotes and you couldn't see it. There they are. Nature take its course. But, well, Singer talks more about that later. Baby K was an anencephalic baby who was actually, Baby K's parents insisted that he be kept alive. I think it might have been a she, I can't remember. Now, anencephalic means lacking a brain. Anencephalics they can be born with fully formed brains, but literally, if you shine a light through one ear, you can see it at the other. Their heads are just filled with fluid. Or occasionally their skull will just end about here, and it will be flat. It'll just be a flat piece of skin stretched across the top because there's no cranial capacity. Literally, they have no cortexes, but they do have a brain stem, and actually it's your brain stem that is responsible for a lot of your bodily functions, like ensuring that you breathe and digest and things like that. And occasionally, I can't remember if it was Karen Quinlan that this happened with, somebody can be taken off their feeding tube, taken off a respirator, that's right. So it has happened before that people have been taken off respirators and continue to live. So their cortical function is gone, and it was assumed that they couldn't breathe on their own. But it turns out because their brainstem was still working, they could breathe on their own. And these people continued to live as long, indefinitely, because in cases where their feeding tube was not allowed to be removed, so long as you feed them. They do need food, but they don't need a respirator. All right, so we might argue that Tony Bland and Baby K, certainly they're human, but we might argue that they're not persons, and that therefore it is not murder to cause their death. Conversely, you have persons whom it would be murder to kill. Well, God, good luck with trying to kill God, because you can't. But God would, if you believe in God, God could be a person without being a human. E.T., remember E.T.? Or, the movie that replaced E.T. as the most watched movie of all time, Avatar. Think of what were those big blue guys called? I've forgotten. Anyway, one of them. Avatar, he's going to make 4 more of those, or 3 or 4 more of those. I think what he doesn't realize is that everyone went to see Avatar not because it was a particularly good movie, but because they hadn't seen really cool 3D before. I think he's going to get a nasty shock if he thinks that everybody loved the movie. But maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, I'm going to go with E.T. because that's my generation. E.T., there's someone who I hope we would regard, if you went up and just killed E.T. and, for medical purposes, that would be monstrous. That would be murder. But he's not human. And Coco, the gorilla. Coco, the gorilla, if you don't know, is a gorilla who has been taught sign language. And actually, she was in the news again because Robin Williams was a buddy of Coco's, and she found out about his death, and she signed lip cry. She was upset and sad because he was someone who made her laugh. Well, Coco can use sign language, but she's not human. And a lot of people say that she has capacities that make her a moral person. There's some dispute about what these capacities are. A lot of people say free will, something like that. But anyway, she might qualify. She's maybe not, but certainly she has a chance. Okay, so it might be the case that you can, just being human is not enough to mean that causing your death is murder. It would be murder to kill me, very much so, very bad, and you to a slightly lesser extent, but maybe not with people like Tony Bland and Baby K. Now, Baby K, she's still the child of parents who do not want this baby to die, but there's medical dispute about whether or not a public hospital has to pay to keep her alive. But if the baby could be kept alive privately, then nobody has the right to go in and just kill the Baby K and say, well, it's not murder because she's not a person, because she's still the child of these people, and you can't do that to people's children, even if they're not persons. But the argument is maybe she's not of the same status. All right. Where were we? Okay. So there's the history of this, and it's interesting that there was little opposition to this, even from pro-life activists. And in fact, some pro-life activists were actually in favor of this. Partly, I think, because it avoided a trick. It meant that they didn't have to deal with this tricky debate, because a lot of people don't think that someone whose brain no longer functions is a valuable life. Whereas if you say that they're actually dead, then the pro-lifers can say, oh no, we don't care about those people, so we're in agreement with the majority, but we don't care about them because they're dead. We care about all living people, but we don't have to care about them because they're dead. Now, that's not true of many pro-life movements, and of course, since this book was published, there was the whole Terri Schiavo thing that some of us are old enough to remember. But then I think the dispute was largely about to the extent of her brain damage. It turned out it was incredibly extensive. She essentially, when they did the autopsy, her brain was fluid. There were all these movies that her parents took that appeared to show her eyes tracking a balloon, but it turned out they'd been filming her for like 12 hours straight, and they edited down for the moments when it was just by coincidence her eyes moved to to apparently track the balloon, because her brain stem is working, and there's all kinds, even anencephalic babies, even babies where their head ends at this point, they will smile, they will do all these kinds of things because that's a brain stem activity, and it can be kind of heartbreaking, but they can't think. Okay. Now, one of the downsides that Singer says to the Harvard committee's decision is that they said whole brain function. But the trouble is, a lot of cases of these people who are brain dead, they have some brain function. And how do you tell when some of the brain is functioning? Should we get complicated equipment so that we can tell whether or not the entire brain is really gone, and if some of the brain is working, then we can't use their bodies for organ transplants? Or, and this is clearly Singer's preference, should we change the definition? Well, actually, with the qualification that he isn't really concerned with the definition of death. But if we're going to do it this way, a better definition would be just the death of the higher function of the brain, the part that controls consciousness. Okay, chapter 3, Dr. Shan's dilemma. Dr. Shan's dilemma, as you'll know if you read the chapter, he is this doctor who was faced with these two babies were in his ward. One who'd had a catastrophic brain bleed, so their brain no longer functioned, but you could not be used as because it met the definition of being alive, because some of the brain was functioning, just would never be conscious. And then there was this child who needed a heart and whose brain was perfectly okay. And he said, I had to watch both of them die because I couldn't take the heart. I was not allowed by law to take the heart out of the one who'd had the brain bleed and use it to attempt to save the life of the one who just had a bad heart. And he said, I propose that we change the definition so that I would be allowed to take the heart out of the cortically dead infant. As he says, I suggest that the organ that really matters is the cerebral cortex. That's the part where consciousness is. If the cortex is dead, there is permanent loss of consciousness and there can be no person. Remember the distinction between human and person. So person is tied to awareness. So you're no longer a person if you're dead. You're still a human, but you're not a person. If the cortex of the brain is dead, the person is dead. I suggest that it should be legal to use the organs from the body of the dead person for transplantation. Dr. Robert Truog, also at this conference that took place in Melbourne in the early 90s, argued that death is a process and the moment of death cannot be discovered. So it's not as if we'll find out when it is. It's up to us. It is a criterion that we can establish. And he says, and notice this is a criterion of death, not an analysis of death, to use Feldman's language. And he says death is the irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness. Another person at the conference, Dr. Margaret DeCampo, talks about new technology in the early 90s. Presumably we have a lot better now. Yeah, we have fMRIs. But anyway, there was 3-vessel angiography that tells what part of the brain blood is flowing in. Dr. Neil Campbell says what we care about is the person rather than the body, and the person drives with the cortex, at which point there is no meaningful sense in which it can be claimed that decisions about life support or organ removal matter to the patient. Dr. Steve Keeley objected by saying regarding anencephalic and cortically dead infants as dead would create an ethical fiction because it would suggest we should bury a child who can still breathe on its own. Pink, supple, and so-called death. And actually, Singer agrees. It would be an ethical fiction, and we don't need to do that. We just need to admit that it's okay to kill some humans. That is, the humans who are not persons, the humans who are not, whose quality of life, whose life does not matter to them. We shouldn't claim that they're already dead. We should admit they're alive because they can breathe. But we should say it's okay to cause their death, to say for good enough reasons, as for example to use their organs. All right. Tony Bland, let's move on to chapter 4. Tony Bland and the Sanctity of Human Life. Tony Bland, this was in the news again. This is a tragedy, a very well-known tragedy in England where there was a football match at football stadium, football meaning soccer, where fans of Liverpool, it was basically, it's very controversial in England because it's been admitted that the police lied. The police blamed hooligans for causing the death when in fact it was police herding people into this area that caused this massive crush of people that caused Tony Bland essentially to have oxygen. People were smushed against a fence. You could see people dying. It was horrific. And his lungs were crushed and his brain was starved of oxygen. And of course, he's in this situation like Terry Shiver. He was cortically dead, but because of his brainstem function, he was in what's called a persistent vegetative state, like between 10 to 25,000 adults in America in 1994. 10 to 25,000 people on life support, but in persistent vegetative state. And not someone who might come out of a coma, but someone whose that part of their brain is dead. Now, the law lords said, what is in the best interest of the patient? So in Belshaw's terms, they were interested in whether or not Tony Bland's life had personal value to Tony Bland. They weren't interested in the case of whether or not he was just alive and whether life should be preserved at all costs. They said, is his life of value to him? And they concluded that it wasn't. So their decision was, it's okay to take him off life support. So what Singer says is, finally, they're making a decision based on quality of life. We have abandoned the idea that all life is of equal value. We've abandoned the sanctity of life view. We say quality of life, and the way to determine that is it of value to the person themselves? And if it isn't, then it's not wrong to let them die. Lord Mustill said, and withdrawing life support was not only legally but ethically justified, since the continued treatment of Anthony Bland can no longer serve to maintain that combination of manifold characteristics which we call a personality. Now, here's an interesting point that that Singer makes. Catholics, of course, are notoriously, well, or famously, pro-life. They're opposed to euthanasia, they're opposed to the death penalty, they're opposed to abortion. But some Catholics have said that it's okay to take people off life support machines. And in fact, some pro-lifers have said that it's okay to take people off life support machines. When they've said that it is wrong to kill people, but it's okay to stop doing extraordinary treatment. I'm overusing the air quotes, but to stop using extraordinary treatment to preserve people's lives. And this is how they justify taking people in PVS states off life support. Now, what Singer says is, this is a fiction. Because notice, you're claiming that it's extraordinary treatment. So we're not advocating killing people. We're just saying you don't have to use extraordinary treatment to keep them alive. But of course, the only reason you call it extraordinary treatment is because you don't value their life. If it's polio victims on a respirator, you would never call the respirator extraordinary treatment because you know they're going to fully recover. You would call that ordinary treatment. You would say it would be murder to remove it. It's only because you don't value the life of people in persistent vegetative sites that suddenly treatment that with people whose lives you value would count as ordinary treatment, you call that extraordinary and say that it's okay to end it. End this fiction, admit that you say that that life is not as valuable as this life, and we can move forward and admit that we've abandoned the sanctity of life view. And this will also allow things like euthanasia, because one of the problems, even with the Law Lords case, was that they just allowed removing feeding tubes and respirator from Tony Bland. And actually, in many cases, as I've said, there are cases where you were only allowed to remove the respirator, and it turned out the person, because their brain stem function, could continue to breathe, and they lived for years and years and years, just sitting there attached to a feeding tube, never conscious again, sucking up resources, and not allowing the parents to let go. There are many heartbreaking cases in this book. We haven't come to some of the most heartbreaking, but Nancy Cruzan is someone who became brain dead in 1983 in Missouri, and the parents wanted to take her off life support, and the Missouri Supreme Court wouldn't let her. Eventually, they relented. The lower court accepted that there was no clear and convincing evidence of their daughter's desire not to have her life spent. Yeah, so they had to do all these things of find people who remembered having conversations with Nancy. Oh yeah, that's right, Nancy, just the week before this happened, Nancy was saying, don't keep me alive, I don't want to be, and these people remembered this all of a sudden. Incidentally, this is why people write living wills. It's very easy to write one if you're interested. You can find the forms on the internet and you can do your own living will, so that if you don't want to be kept alive on life support, you can establish for yourself And that is something I think that has changed since this book was written. But what's interesting is that on her gravestone it says departed January 11th, 1983, which was when her brain was damaged. At peace, December 26th, 1990. In other words, the parents were convinced that she was gone. So they're very much, they say she dies when her brain dies, when she ceases to be a person. But she said she was finally at peace in 1990. So this is sort of a dig at the Missouri Supreme Court, saying you kept her, nearly 8 years longer. You kept her corpse on a feeding tube, and they were very upset about this. Anyway, back to Tony Bland. They had to let him starve to death, and this was actually like the case. Actually, much worse is the case of Baby Doe, who was a child born with Down syndrome. The parents didn't want it, and this was before the days where you could do a test for Down, so they didn't know they were going to have a Down's child. And they said, we don't want it, and the baby, as is not uncommon with Downs, had an esophageal blockage so that the food would not reach the stomach. And it would be, if the child was normal, the blockage would be an easy surgery to remove. But because it was a Downs baby, they said, we refuse our consent to have the blockage removed. And this was basically, the doctor said, okay, this is an easy way where we can get rid of this child that nobody wants. And the child starves to death. And that's horrific. Now, Singer says, look, if you don't think this is a life worth living, if we decide as a culture that we don't want these babies to live, then don't let the baby starve to death. That's just cruel. You should be able to just give the baby an overdose of morphine. And the same thing with Tony Bland. Now, of course, it's not cruel to Tony Bland because he can't feel pain. But why not end it quickly? Lord Brown Wilkinson makes the same point. How can it be lawful to allow a patient to die slowly, though painlessly, because no brain, over a period of weeks from lack of food, but unlawful to produce his immediate death by lethal injection, thereby saving his family from yet another ordeal to add to the tragedy that has already struck them? So he wanted to move forward even further than the law lords did and to allow euthanasia. And we'll get to discussion of that later in the book. Okay. Wow, gone over an hour.